My parents gave my sister $1 million and kicked me out into the street, calling me a waste of space. So, I lived in my car, built an empire from nothing, and set a trap they never saw coming. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Inherited Revenge. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The thermometer on my bedside table read 102.4 degrees. I stared at the digital numbers through blurry, heavy eyelids, my entire body aching with the deep, settling chill of a severe chest infection. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the gray light filtering through my childhood bedroom window did nothing to lift the oppressive weight on my chest. I drew in a ragged, shallow breath, suppressing the urge to cough because I knew the sharp, tearing pain that would follow. I just needed a few more days. I was 24, in the final agonizing weeks of finishing my business degree, and completely exhausted. I had been working 30 hours a week at a local distribution center while taking a full course load, pushing my body far past its breaking point. This illness was my body finally demanding the rest I had denied it for years. Slowly, painfully, I pushed the heavy duvet off my shivering frame. I needed water, and perhaps a moment of sympathy from my mother, Barbara. I wrapped myself in a thick, worn bathrobe, tying the belt tightly around my waist as if it could hold my fragile energy together. Every step down the carpeted stairs was an event, my knees trembling with the effort. The house was eerily quiet as I reached the bottom step. Normally, the television in the living room would be blaring one of my father's golf tournaments, or my mother would be aggressively rearranging the throw pillows for the third time that day. But today, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I shuffled toward the kitchen, leaning heavily against the hallway wall for support. As I rounded the corner, I stopped. My parents, Barbara and Benjamin, were sitting at the large oak dining table. Spread out before them were stacks of glossy folders, bank statements, and what looked like legal documents. Sitting across from them, radiating an aura of unearned confidence and wearing a designer silk blouse that cost more than my entire semester's tuition, was my younger sister, Alice. "Mom, Dad," I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Is everything okay? I feel terrible." Barbara looked up, her expression instantly tightening into a mask of irritation. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't offer to make me tea. Instead, she let out a sharp, exasperated sigh and placed her manicured hands flat on the table. "Mia, we were actually just going to come upstairs and wake you," Benjamin said, his voice completely devoid of paternal warmth. He adjusted his glasses, refusing to meet my feverish gaze. "Sit down. We have something important to discuss." I pulled out a chair, my joints screaming in protest, and collapsed into it. "What is it?" I asked, looking between the three of them. Alice was scrolling through her phone, entirely disinterested in my physical distress, a faint, smug smile playing on her lips. "Alice is launching her new business venture," Barbara announced, her voice suddenly swelling with a pride she had never, not once, directed toward me. "It is a holistic lifestyle and atmospheric curation brand. It is going to completely revolutionize the wellness space. She has a vision, Mia, a true, generational vision." I blinked, trying to process the words through the fog of my fever. Atmospheric curation brand? What does that even mean? Alice finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Mia. Just because you're obsessed with boring supply chains and logistics doesn't mean you can understand high-concept aesthetics. It's about aligning personal spaces with inner vibrations. It's highly exclusive." "Right," I muttered, too sick to argue. "That's great, Alice, congratulations, but why did you need to wake me up for this?" Benjamin cleared his throat, a nervous habit he always relied on when he was about to do something cowardly. "Well, Mia, Alice is going to need a base of operations, a creative sanctuary, if you will, to film her content, host her high-net-worth clients, and really let her creative energies flow." Okay, I said slowly, a cold knot beginning to form in my stomach that had nothing to do with the illness. And, Barbara interjected, her tone turning glacial, your presence here is incredibly disruptive to her flow. You're always studying at all hours, you look completely drained all the time, and quite frankly, your energy is very stagnant. You're just wasting space here, Mia. We need you to leave. The words hung in the air, heavy and violent. I stared at my mother, certain I had misheard her. Leave? Mom, I live here. I pay you rent every single month from my warehouse job. I have a fever of over 102 degrees. I'm taking my final exams in 2 weeks. Where am I supposed to go? That is exactly the negative mindset we're talking about, Barbara snapped, slamming a hand down on the table. Always making it about your problems, your little struggles. Alice is on the verge of greatness. We have decided to fully back her. We are remortgaging the house and cashing out our entire retirement fund. We are giving her $1 million seed investment. My jaw dropped. $1 million. The money they had saved their entire lives, the equity of the home I had helped them pay the mortgage on when Dad lost his job 5 years ago. You're giving her $1 million for a fake wellness company? I gasped, the shock temporarily overpowering my sickness. Dad, please tell me you aren't doing this. You'll lose everything. Enough, Benjamin barked, finally looking at me, his eyes hard and defensive. Alice is a visionary. She deserves this chance. And we deserve to be part of her success. We are refunding your last month's rent. That should be plenty for you to find a motel. We need your room cleared out by tonight so the contractors can start expanding the master suite for her studio. Tonight, I whispered, tears of pure disbelief springing to my eyes. I am sick. I have nowhere to go. I'm your daughter. Barbara stood up, crossing her arms over her chest, looking down at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. You are an adult, Mia. Figure it out. We are done coddling you while you waste your potential on a meaningless degree. Pack your things. If you aren't gone by 8 o'clock, I'll have your father put your boxes on the lawn. I looked at Alice, who was already back to scrolling on her phone, entirely unaffected by the fact that her sister was being thrown into the streets. I looked at my parents, seeing nothing but cold, delusional greed in their eyes. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, shattering every illusion of family I had ever held onto. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The next 4 hours were a blur of agonizing physical exertion and profound psychological trauma. My body felt like it was made of lead, every movement sending sharp spikes of pain through my chest. I dragged myself up the stairs, my breathing harsh and ragged, and began shoving my entire life into heavy-duty trash bags and a few battered cardboard boxes. I didn't pack everything. I couldn't. I left behind my childhood books, the debate team trophies I had won in high school, achievements my parents had never bothered to attend, and the comfortable winter blankets that were too bulky to carry. I only took my clothes, my laptop, my textbooks, and the few mementos that actually mattered to me. Every time I carried a load down the stairs, I had to pass the living room. My parents and Alice were sitting on the plush sofas, laughing and drinking champagne to celebrate Alice's seed round. Not once did they look my way. Not once did my mother ask if I needed help carrying the heavy boxes while clearly struggling to breathe. They had completely erased me from their reality the moment I became an inconvenience to their golden child's fantasy. By 7:30 p.m., the winter sun had set, plunging the neighborhood into a freezing, damp darkness. A light, icy rain had begun to fall, slicking the pavement and chilling me to the bone. I stood by my 2008 Honda Civic, the trunk stuffed to the brim, the back seats piled high with black trash bags. I looked back at the house one last time. The warm yellow light spilled from the living room windows. I could see their silhouettes. A family of 3. I got into my car, the interior smelling faintly of stale coffee and old upholstery. I turned the key. The engine sputtered, struggled, and finally roared to life, the heater violently blowing cold air against my damp face. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires splashing through icy puddles, and drove until I found a brightly lit, 24-hour superstore parking lot. This was it. This was my home now. I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go, pulling my winter coat tightly around my trembling body. The fever was raging now, my skin alternating between burning hot and freezing cold. I stared up at the orange glow of the parking lot lights filtering through the rain-streaked windshield, a profound, crushing loneliness pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the silence of the car was shattered by my phone buzzing in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dark interior, displaying a single word: Mom. For a brief, pathetic second, the wounded child inside me hoped. I hoped she had looked at my empty room, felt a pang of maternal guilt, and was calling to tell me to come back, that they had made a terrible mistake. My hands shaking, I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. Mom, I croaked. Mia, finally, Barbara's voice clipped through the speaker, sharp and annoyed. There was no hesitation, no softness. Listen, I am trying to log into the main smart home hub so Alice can sync her mood lighting panels, but you changed the admin password last month when you fixed the router. What is it? I closed my eyes, a hot tear slipping down my cheek, burning against my feverish skin. I'm in a parking lot, Mom. It's 30 degrees outside and I can barely breathe. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Mia, Barbara sighed loudly. In the background, I could hear Alice whining. Mom, tell her to hurry up. My aura is literally getting bruised by this harsh overhead light. We all make our own beds, Barbara continued coldly. You chose to be difficult today. Now, just give me the password so we can move on with our evening. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it paralyzed me for a moment. They had thrown me out like garbage, handed away my future security, and now they were annoyed that I wasn't providing tech support from my freezing car. The password, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper that surprised even me, is my birthday. Not that you would remember it. I hung up the phone and powered it off completely. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. The tears stopped falling. The crushing sadness that had been suffocating me for the last 5 hours suddenly evaporated, replaced by something entirely different. It was a cold, hard, crystalline clarity. A slow-burning fire of pure, unadulterated resolve ignited in the pit of my stomach, cutting right through the fever. I looked around my cramped, freezing car. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was a weak, irrelevant background character in the glamorous movie of Alice's life. They believed they could discard me without consequence. As I huddled under my thin coat, listening to the icy rain hit the roof of my car, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself. I would survive this. I would build a life so incredibly successful, so untouchable, that they would one day look up from the ashes of their own foolish decisions and realize exactly what they had thrown away. They had taken my home, my security, and my family, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand the depth of my parents' delusion, you have to understand the history of my sacrifices, and the pristine, polished fraud that was my sister, Alice. For as long as I could remember, I was the designated survivor of the family, the shock absorber for every crisis. When Dad lost his middle management job during my sophomore year of high school, it wasn't Alice who stepped up. Alice, who was a freshman at the time, threw a massive tantrum because she couldn't get the newest smartphone. I, on the other hand, immediately got a job at a local diner, working closing shifts every night just so I could quietly slip my tip money into the kitchen drawer to help cover the electric bill and buy groceries. When it came time for college, I attended the local state university, living at home to save money, working full-time in warehouses and logistics hubs to pay my own tuition without asking them for a dime. I studied late into the night, mapping out supply chains, analyzing market inefficiencies, and building the foundational knowledge for a company I had dreamed of starting since I was 18. And Alice floated. Alice was an aesthetic visionary, which was a polite way of saying she was a deeply entitled, highly manipulative narcissist who refused to work a real job. She was completely polished. Her social media feeds a carefully curated grid of beige tones, expensive matcha lattes, and stolen quotes about inner peace and manifesting wealth. She spoke in a gentle, hushed tone that sounded soothing until you realized the words coming out of her mouth were entirely devoid of substance. She called herself a holistic lifestyle guru. In reality, she was an unemployed 22-year-old whose primary skill set consisted of maxing out our father's credit cards on luxury, retreats in Bali, and convincing our parents that her constant financial demands were actually investments in her spiritual capital. I remembered the pitch she had given them just a week before I was evicted. I had been sitting in the kitchen, exhausted after a 10-hour shift, eating cold leftovers. Alice had glided into the room, wearing a flowing linen outfit, and laid a single, glossy folder on the table in front of our parents. "Mom, Dad," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I have finally achieved clarity. The universe has downloaded my purpose into my spirit." Benjamin had leaned forward, practically weeping with pride. "Tell us, sweetheart." Alice opened the folder. There were no financial projections. There was no market analysis. There was no business plan. It was just 10 pages of mood boards featuring pictures of expensive minimalist furniture, abstract art, and women doing yoga on private beaches. "I am launching Aura and Align," Alice declared. "It is a bespoke, high-vibrational consultancy. I will curate the personal atmospheres of elite clients to maximize their holistic flow. But to attract high-net-worth clients, I must project a high-net-worth reality. I need $1 million for branding, a complete home studio renovation, and a 6-month immersive research trip to the Amalfi Coast." I had scoffed from the kitchen counter. I couldn't help it. "Alice, that's not a business plan. That's a vacation funded by a robbery. You're asking Mom and Dad for their entire retirement savings for what? Good vibes." Alice had turned to me, her perfectly manicured facade slipping for just a fraction of a second. Her eyes, usually wide and innocent, narrowed into cold, calculating slits. It was the look of a predator whose meal had just been interrupted. "Mia," she had said, her voice dropping its breathy tone and becoming sharp and pointed. "Your lower-tier vibrational energy is exactly why you will always be stuck in a warehouse. You lack vision. You lack expansion. Mom, Dad, do you feel how her presence literally drains the abundance from this room?" And they had agreed. They had nodded eagerly, mesmerized by her buzzwords and her beauty, utterly blind to the fact that she was systematically draining their lifeblood. Alice didn't want to build a business. She wanted to secure her luxury lifestyle, and she didn't care if she had to leave our parents penniless and push me into the streets to get it. Sitting in my freezing car, shivering uncontrollably, I finally saw her clearly. She wasn't just a spoiled sister. She was a parasite, and my parents were her willing hosts. I closed my eyes, letting the fever burn through me, forging my grief into a weapon. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. The morning sun crested over the horizon, casting a harsh, pale light into the frosted interior of my Honda Civic. I woke up with my neck cramped at a horrific angle, my breath pluming in the freezing air of the superstore parking lot. My fever had broken during the night, leaving me hollowed out, incredibly weak, but blessedly clear-headed. I sat up slowly, my joints cracking in the cold, and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My skin was pale, my eyes ringed with deep purple shadows, and my hair was a tangled mess. I looked exactly like a 24-year-old girl who had just been thrown away by her family. But underneath the exhaustion, that cold, hard fire of resolve was still burning. I did not cry. I reached into the backseat, pulled a bottle of water from a plastic grocery bag, and took a long drink. Then I opened my laptop. The next 5 years were a grueling, relentless exercise in survival and strategic expansion. I never went back to that house. I spent my final 2 weeks of college living in my car, showering in the student recreation center at 5 in the morning, and studying in the darkest, quietest corners of the university library until they kicked me out at midnight. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma in business and supply chain management, I looked out into the crowd. There was no one holding a balloon for me. There was no one cheering my name. The silence in my heart was profound, but I used it as fuel. I took the tiny amount of money I had saved from the warehouse, along with the refunded rent my parents had thrown at me, and I started my own logistics brokerage, Apex Distribution. I didn't have an office. My passenger seat was my filing cabinet, and my steering wheel was my desk. I spent 18 hours a day cold calling manufacturers, distributors, and freight companies. I hunted for inefficiencies in their supply chains, offering to restructure their shipping routes for a fraction of what they were currently paying. For the first 2 years, I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and instant coffee, funneling every single penny of profit back into the business. Slowly, the tide began to turn. A mid-sized agricultural firm took a chance on my routing algorithm. I saved them $300,000 in a single quarter. Word spread. By year 3, I was no longer sleeping in my car. I had a modest apartment and a team of 5 employees. By year 4, Apex Distribution secured a massive, multi-year contract with a national retail chain, catapulting my net worth into the 8-figure range. But no matter how successful I became, I never took my eyes off my sister. As my resources grew, my investigation into Alice's business, Aura and Align, deepened. It started as a dark curiosity, but it quickly became a meticulous, calculated operation. Using my industry connections, I pulled public shipping manifests, commerci, AL import records, and vendor filings. It took me less than 3 weeks to completely unravel the pristine, million-dollar lie she had sold my parents. Alice wasn't curating bespoke atmospheres. She wasn't manufacturing high-end wellness products. The shipping manifests revealed that she was importing the cheapest, lowest-grade synthetic incense and mass-produced decorative pillows from unregulated overseas factories for pennies on the dollar. She was repackaging them in beige cardboard boxes and attempting to sell them online at a 2,000% markup. Worse, I tracked the commercial flow of the million-dollar seed investment. She hadn't spent it on marketing or product development. She had leased an opulent, absurdly expensive storefront in a high-rent downtown district just to film aesthetic videos for her social media. The rest of the money had vanished into business expenses that coincidentally aligned with her trips to private resorts in the Maldives, designer wardrobes, and luxury car leases. But the most crucial piece of leverage, the trap I carefully set and waited to spring, arose in the 5th year. Alice's business, predictably, was bleeding out. She was failing to move her cheap inventory, and she had taken out massive, high-interest commercial lines of credit to keep her luxury lifestyle afloat. Her primary creditor was a mid-tier commercial lending firm looking to offload toxic, defaulting debt. Operating through a blind subsidiary LLC, I purchased the entirety of Aura and Align's commercial debt. I bought the lease to her warehouse. I bought the outstanding invoices for her suppliers. I was no longer just the sister they had thrown away. I was, legally and unconditionally, the owner of her financial ruin. I held the keys to her destruction, neatly filed in a server in my corporate office, waiting for the inevitable moment she finally collapsed. The collapse arrived exactly 5 years and 2 months after I was kicked out into the freezing rain. I was 29 years old. I was sitting on the expansive, sun-drenched mahogany deck of my newly purchased beachfront villa. The ocean breeze was warm, carrying the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. I held a cup of perfectly brewed artisan tea, a far cry from the stale parking lot water of my past. The estate was completely gated, a sanctuary of glass, white stone, and manicured gardens that I had built with my own 2 hands. It was a Tuesday afternoon, peacefully quiet, until the jarring, aggressive sound of screeching tires shattered the tranquility. I stood up, walking toward the edge of the deck that overlooked the winding coastal road and my private, wrought-iron security gates. A rusted, dented sedan had aggressively swerved onto the shoulder of the road, stopping inches from my property line. I recognized the car immediately. It was my father's old commuter vehicle, looking infinitely worse for wear. The passenger door flew open, hitting a decorative stone planter with a loud crunch. Alice stumbled out. She was no longer wearing designer silk. She was dressed in stained sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her hair unwashed and tied in a frantic knot. She gripped the wrought iron bars of my gate, her knuckles turning white, staring up at the sprawling villa, the private infinity pool, and the luxury SUV parked in the circular driveway. Then she saw me standing on the deck. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She didn't wave. She didn't say hello. She threw her head back and let out a guttural, hysterical scream that echoed over the sound of the crashing waves. "Why does she get everything?" Alice shrieked, her voice cracking violently. She slammed her fists against the iron gate. "It was supposed to be me. This is MY manifestation. This is MY life." The driver's side door opened slowly, and my mother, Barbara, stepped out. The last 5 years had not been kind to her. The arrogant, polished matriarch who had coldly ordered me out of her house was gone. She looked frail, deeply exhausted, and overwhelmed by a profound, settling panic. She rushed to Alice, trying to pull her away from the gate, but Alice shoved her backward. "Mia," Barbara called out, her voice trembling, finally spotting me on the deck. "Mia, please, open the gate. We have been driving around for hours doing delivery jobs. We saw you standing there. Mia, you have to let us in. We need to talk to you." I set my teacup down on the glass patio table. The porcelain clinked softly. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt the cool, calculated calm of a strategist whose target had finally wandered into the crosshairs. I walked down the sweeping outdoor staircase, my footsteps echoing methodically against the stone, until I stood just a few feet away from them, separated only by the heavy iron bars. "Hello, Barbara," I said evenly, completely ignoring my sister's frantic hyperventilating. "You look tired. I thought you'd be living on the Amalfi Coast by now." "Don't you dare speak to our mother with that tone," Alice hissed, pressing her face against the bars, her eyes wide and manic. "You stole this. You stole my energy. You knew I was destined for an oceanfront creative space, and you actively blocked my vibrational path to steal it for yourself." "Alice, please stop talking," Barbara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. She looked at me, her hands gripping the iron as if it were a lifeline. "Mia, things have gotten very difficult. Alice's business. The market was incredibly unfair to her. We lost the house. We lost everything, Mia. We are living in a weekly motel. You have this massive estate. You have all this space. You must let us move in. We are your family." I looked into my mother's eyes, searching for an apology, searching for any acknowledgement of the night she left me to freeze. There was nothing. Only entitlement and a desperate demand for salvation. "You lost the house," I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And you blame the market." "The market shifted," Alice screamed, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "People aren't ready for holistic alignment. It wasn't my fault. I put the work in. I spent the $1 million on brand building." "Did you?" I asked, taking a single step closer to the gate. "Because according to the commercial shipping manifests I have been tracking for the last 5 years, you spent exactly $22,000 on cheap, toxic, flammable cushions from an unregulated warehouse in overseas bulk. You spent the remaining $978,000 on first-class flights, luxury handbags, and leasing a sports car that was repossessed 3 months ago." Alice froze, the hysterical screaming cut off instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. All the color drained from her face. Barbara whipped her head around to stare at her youngest daughter. "What? What is she talking about, Alice? Toxic cushions? You told us you were employing artisan weavers in a fair trade commune. You showed us the brochures." "She's lying," Alice exploded, her voice reaching an unnatural, panicked pitch. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "She's photoshopping documents. She's a hacker. Mom, don't listen to her. She's just jealous. She's always been jealous of my light. I am going to sue you, Mia. I'm going to get my lawyers and take this house because you clearly committed corporate espionage to ruin my brand." "You don't have lawyers, Alice," I said, my voice cutting through her pathetic lies like a scalpel. "And you don't have a brand. What you have is a mountain of defaulted commercial debt." I looked directly at my mother, who was now trembling visibly. "I suggest you take your daughter back to your motel, Barbara, before I call the police and have you both removed for trespassing." I turned my back on them and walked slowly up the stairs, ignoring the renewed, desperate screaming of my sister and the sudden, shattered sobbing of my mother. The trap had been set, but the investigation was not yet complete. I knew there was a deeper, much darker secret they were hiding. Over the next 72 hours, my corporate email inbox and my company's public contact forms were flooded with absolute madness. Alice had completely lost her grip on reality. She sent dozens of emails, oscillating between poorly spelled legal threats demanding the deed to my villa, and bizarre, spiritual guilt trips claiming that the universe would curse my bloodline if I didn't fund her comeback tour. I forwarded every single communication to my legal team to be archived. I was not worried about Alice's empty threats. I was focused on the missing piece of the puzzle. When Barbara had stood at my gate and said, "We lost the house," the mathematics of the situation had bothered me. $1 million is a massive amount of money, but my parents' house had been fully paid off before they remortgaged it to give Alice her seed money. Even if Alice had burned through the initial $1 million in cash, my parents should have had enough residual income from my father's meager pension to keep up with the new mortgage payments. The house shouldn't have been foreclosed on so quickly. Something was mathematically wrong. I sat in my corner office at Apex Distribution, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I instructed my lead financial analyst to pull the municipal property records and foreclosure filings for my childhood home. When the analyst brought the printed dossier into my office 2 hours later, his face was grim. "You're going to want to look at page 4, Mia," he said quietly, placing the folder on my desk. "It's pretty aggressive fraud." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the dense legal text of the property filings. There was the first remortgage, the one they had proudly announced on the day they kicked me out. But beneath that file, 3 years later, was a second, massive home equity line of credit. It had been taken out for an additional $400,000, entirely leveraging the remaining, artificial value of the home. I looked closely at the signature page. There were my parents' names, Benjamin and Barbara, but the handwriting was entirely wrong. The loops on the B in Barbara were sharp and jagged, completely missing my mother's fluid, cursive style. The Benjamin was rushed and cramped. I knew that handwriting intimately. It was the same handwriting that had scrawled demanding grocery lists and entitled notes on my bedroom door for years. Alice had forged our parents' signatures. She had secretly hollowed out the very last drops of equity in their home to fund her failing lifestyle, directly causing the foreclosure that put them on the street. A knock on my office door pulled me from the documents. My executive assistant stepped in, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mia, I am so sorry to interrupt, but there is an older couple in the lobby. They are refusing to leave. They say they are your parents, and they are demanding to speak with you about saving the family." "Send them up," I said softly, my eyes never leaving the forged signatures. "Put them in conference room B." 10 minutes later, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled conference room. The contrast was incredibly jarring. The room was a masterpiece of modern corporate design, featuring a massive slab of polished marble for a table. Sitting at the far end, looking incredibly small and out of place, were Benjamin and Barbara. My father's suit jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. They stood up immediately as I entered. "Mia," Benjamin started, his voice cracking with a forced paternal authority that he no longer possessed. "We are here to put an end to this nonsense. Family is family. You have clearly done very well for yourself. We are proud of you. But Alice is in a very dark place. Her vision requires capital to pivot. We need you to write a check to stabilize her company, and we need to discuss moving into the guest wing of your house." I didn't sit down. I walked to the head of the marble table and placed the thick, leather-bound dossier down with a heavy thud. "You still believe her?" I stated, the realization filling me with a profound, icy disappointment. Even after what I told you at the gate, even after you lost your home, you are still defending her. She made mistakes, Barbara cried out, clutching her purse to her chest. She trusted the wrong suppliers. She was manipulated by overseas vendors. She is a victim in this, Mia. How can you be so cold to your own sister when she is hurting? Because she isn't hurting, I replied, my voice echoing off the glass walls. She is a predator, and you are her prey. I opened the folder, extracted the property records, and slid the documents across the smooth marble table until they rested directly in front of my father. Look at the second page, I commanded. Benjamin adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers. He stared at the document, his brow furrowed in confusion. This is a second mortgage line of credit. From 2 years ago, we never authorized this. We never signed this. Look at the signatures, Dad, I said, stepping closer. Look at them very carefully. Barbara leaned over his shoulder. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and heavy, as the undeniable truth slowly penetrated their decades of willful ignorance. I watched my father's hands begin to shake violently. The color drained completely from my mother's face. Alice forged your signatures, I stated, ensuring the words hung in the air with absolute clarity. She stole an additional $400,000 of debt in your name. She didn't just fail at business. She committed severe financial fraud, and she intentionally orchestrated the destruction of your lives to buy herself a few more months of luxury. Benjamin collapsed back into his chair, the document slipping from his fingers to the floor. No, he whispered, a broken, hollow sound. No, she wouldn't do this, she wouldn't. She was just reallocating funds for her vision, she told us. But the lie was dead. The irrefutable proof was lying on the floor between us, and the final, crushing weight of their terrible choices had finally come crashing down. 2 days after the shattering revelation in my corporate conference room, I received a group text message from my Aunt Susan. It was an invitation to a family healing and reconnection circle at her home in the suburbs. The message was dripping with guilt-inducing language, stating that the family was broken and that it was my moral and spiritual duty to attend so we could support Alice through her difficult transition. I knew exactly what this was. Alice, terrified by the impending collapse of her world and realizing that our parents were no longer her blind defenders, had pivoted her strategy. She was weaponizing the extended family. She had clearly spun a tragic, tear-soaked narrative to my aunts, uncles, and cousins, painting herself as the victim of a cruel, wealthy older sister who had hoarded all the family's resources. She wanted a public arena to shame me into writing a check. She wanted an audience. I decided to give her one she would never forget. I arrived at Aunt Susan's house precisely at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The street was lined with the cars of my relatives. I walked up the driveway, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks, carrying a sleek, heavy leather briefcase. When I stepped through the front door, the low murmur of conversation in the living room instantly died. The entire extended family was gathered. Aunts, uncles, and older cousins were seated on folding chairs and floral sofas, their faces arranged in identical expressions of stern, judgmental disappointment. And there, sitting perfectly in the center of the room on a plush ottoman, was Alice. She was dressed in an oversized, drab gray sweater, her hair intentionally messy, clutching a tissue. She looked like a perfect, fragile martyr. My parents, Benjamin and Barbara, were seated in the far corner. They did not look at me. They stared blankly at the floor, looking like hollowed-out ghosts carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Mia, Aunt Susan said, stepping forward with her arms crossed, her voice tight with disapproval. I'm glad you decided to show up. Your sister is in a crisis, and your refusal to help her is tearing this family apart. We are all here today to stage an intervention. Your corporate greed cannot override your blood. I walked slowly into the center of the room, standing just a few feet away from Alice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show a single ounce of anger. I embodied the cold, untouchable calm of a CEO who was about to liquidate a hostile entity. "Is that what she told you, Aunt Susan?" I asked, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet room. "Did she tell you I was greedy?" Alice sniffled loudly, dabbing at her dry eyes. "Mia, please," she whispered, projecting a trembling vulnerability. "I don't want to fight. The universe is testing me, and I just need my family to surround me with abundance. You have millions. You have a mansion. I just need a bridge loan to realign my brand. If you don't help me, I'm going to end up on the street. Haven't I suffered enough?" A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the relatives. Uncle Robert shook his head in disgust at me. "You want a bridge loan," I repeated calmly. I clicked open the golden clasps of my briefcase. The sound was sharp in the silent room. "You gathered our entire family here to pressure me into giving you money to save your brand. So, let's talk about your brand." I pulled out a thick stack of professionally bound folders. I handed the first one to Aunt Susan, then passed the others around the room to my uncles and cousins. Alice's eyes darted to the folders, a flash of genuine, unmasked panic finally breaking through her martyr facade. "What is this?" Aunt Susan asked, frowning as she opened the cover. "Those are the complete, unredacted financial records of Aura and Align," I announced, projecting my voice so every person in the room could hear me clearly. Over the last 5 years, Alice did not build a business. She took the $1 million our parents gave her, their entire life savings, and she spent it. Open to page 3. The rustling of heavy paper filled the room. "You will see the vendor invoices," I continued methodically. "She spent $22,000 on cheap, toxic imported decor. Now turn to page 5. You will see her personal expense ledger. She spent $978,000 on luxury vacations to the Maldives, designer wardrobes, and leasing sports cars. She burned through $1 million of our parents' retirement to play pretend on the internet." "That's a lie," Alice shrieked, leaping up from the ottoman, her gentle whisper completely vanishing. "She fabricated those. She's a hacker. She's trying to ruin my energy." "I bought your commercial debt, Alice," I said, stepping toward her, forcing her to step back. "I own the server your records are hosted on. It's not a lie, but the $1 million isn't the reason we are all here today. Aunt Susan, please turn to the final page in the folder." The room was suffocatingly tense. Aunt Susan turned the page, her eyes scanning the complex legal document. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Alice," I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute, chilling authority. "Explain to the family why our parents lost their home. Explain to them why they are living in a weekly motel." Alice opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing that the doors were locked and walls were closing in. "I'll explain it," I said, turning to address my shocked relatives. 3 years after squandering the initial $1 million, Alice ran out of money. But she couldn't let go of the luxury lifestyle, so she went behind our parents' backs. She took out a massive second mortgage on their fully paid-off home, $400,000, and to do it, she committed felony fraud. She forged their signatures on the banking documents. A collective gasp echoed through the living room. Uncle Robert dropped the folder onto the coffee table as if it were on fire. "No," Alice screamed, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. She spun around, pointing frantically at Benjamin and Barbara in the corner. "They knew. Mom, Dad, tell them you knew. Tell them you told me to do it. Tell them." The room held its breath, waiting for my parents to speak. For my entire life, they had shielded her. For my entire life, they had enabled her worst impulses and sacrificed me to protect her delusions. My father, Benjamin, slowly stood up. He looked 10 years older than he had just a few days ago. He looked at Alice, and for the first time in 27 years, the blinding veil of favoritism was entirely gone. "We didn't know," Benjamin said, his voice trembling at first, but gaining a powerful, heartbreaking strength with every word. He stepped out of the corner, moving toward the center of the room. "We gave you everything, Alice. We threw your sister out into the freezing rain when she was sick because you told us she was ruining your vision. We gave you our retirement, and in return, you stole our names. You forged our signatures, and you let the bank take the home we raised you in." "Dad, please," Alice sobbed, reaching out to him, trying to grab his arm. "My vibrations were off. The universe forced my hand. I needed the money for the brand." "Stop talking about the universe," Benjamin roared, a sound of such profound, shattered anguish that several family members flinched. He pulled his arm away from her violently. "There is no brand. There is only a selfish, cruel little girl who destroyed her family for a handbag. You watched your mother cry in a motel room, knowing you put her there. You are no daughter of mine." Barbara stood up then, tears streaming continuously down her pale cheeks. She walked over to stand next to my father. She didn't say a word to Alice. She just looked at her with an expression of pure, devastating horror, and then she turned her back on her youngest child. Alice collapsed onto the floor, wailing, her hands covering her face, completely and utterly exposed. The family intervention she had orchestrated had become the stage for her absolute destruction. The spell was broken. She had nowhere left to hide. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. The Monday following the confrontation at Aunt Susan's house, my corporate attorneys, acting on my strict instructions, forwarded the complete dossier of Alice's forged documents to the fraud division of the commercial lending bank. Because the loan had crossed state lines during the digital approval process, it triggered a federal inquiry. 3 weeks later, I received a quiet phone call from my lead attorney. Alice had been arrested at a luxury spa where she was attempting to use a newly opened, high-interest credit card to pay for a trauma release massage. She was formally charged with felony forgery, wire fraud, and grand theft. Because she had actively attempted to flee the state to avoid the mounting civil lawsuits from her unpaid vendors, the judge denied her bail. The holistic lifestyle guru was now sitting in a county holding cell, her beige aesthetic replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit. Her fake company was liquidated, her social media accounts were seized by creditors, and she was completely, permanently exiled from our extended family. With the architect of my family's ruin finally facing justice, there was only one loose end remaining. I arranged to meet my parents at a quiet, beautiful botanical garden in the city. It was a neutral location, far away from my beachfront villa and far away from their depressing motel. We sat on a wrought iron bench beneath the sprawling branches of a weeping willow, the sound of a nearby water fountain providing a gentle backdrop to the heavy silence. They both looked fragile, broken by the reality of what they had nurtured and what they had thrown away. "Mia," my mother started, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were tightly clasped in her lap. "We don't expect you to forgive us, what we did to you that night. What we allowed to happen, it is the greatest failure of our lives." "We were blind," my father added, a tear finally escaping and tracing down his weathered cheek. "We were so desperate to have a special daughter that we ignored the brilliant, hardworking daughter standing right in front of us. Why? O paid our mortgage, Mia. You cared for us. And we threw you out into the cold because we were foolish and arrogant. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry." I listened to their apologies. I analyzed their words, their tone, their body language. There was no manipulation here. There was only the crushing, agonizing weight of true remorse. The golden child illusion had shattered, and the shards had cut them to the bone. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The anger that had fueled me for 5 years, the cold, hard fire that had driven me to build an empire from the front seat of a Honda Civic, slowly began to extinguish. It had served its purpose. It had kept me alive, but holding onto it now would only poison the peace I had finally earned. "I forgive you," I said softly. They both looked up, their eyes wide with shock and desperate hope. "But," I continued, my voice firm and uncompromising, setting the absolute boundaries of our new reality. "Forgiveness does not mean pretending the past didn't happen. You will not be moving into my villa. You will not have access to my corporate accounts, and we will not be returning to the dynamic we had before. My father nodded vigorously, wiping his eyes. We understand, Mia. We expect nothing from you. We just wanted to tell you how sorry we are. I have purchased a small, 2-bedroom condominium in a quiet retirement community across town, I told them, handing my father a simple brass key. The deed is in a trust, controlled by my attorneys, so it can never be leveraged or remortgaged. Your utilities and basic groceries will be paid for by a modest monthly stipend I have arranged. It is not a luxury estate. It is safe, it is warm, and it is yours for the rest of your lives. Barbara broke down into racking sobs, reaching out with trembling hands to gently touch my arm, as if afraid I would pull away. Thank you, she wept, her voice thick with gratitude. Thank you, Mia. You are far better to us than we ever deserved. I stood up from the bench, looking down at the 2 people who had given me life, who had broken my heart, and who I had ultimately saved. Take care of yourselves, Mom, Dad, I said quietly. I turned and walked down the cobblestone path of the botanical garden, leaving them to begin their long, quiet process of healing. An hour later, I was back on the expansive mahogany deck of my beachfront villa. The sun was beginning to set over the ocean, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of violet and gold. I leaned against the glass railing, listening to the rhythmic, eternal crashing of the waves against the shore. The air was clean, salty, and completely free of the toxic weight of the past. I had been told I was wasting space. I had been thrown away. But from the ashes of their betrayal, I had built a fortress. Justice had been served, the truth had been dragged into the light, and as I looked out over the vast, glittering expanse of the water, I felt nothing but an absolute, unbreakable sense of peace. I had won.